Hi guys, welcome to the October VueJS meetup. This is going to be the sign patterns in VueJS. Quick introduction about me. My name is German, or Herman, whichever you guys want to use. It's really the Spanish version of Herman. Been a developer for about a little over 1.5 years at this point. I think it's more like almost 2 years at this point. And one quick note about me is that Vue was actually my first front-end framework that I learned. And the way I actually learned it was because we had the UCF Coding Bootcamp, and while Vue.js is not technically part of the curriculum, for one of the projects where we were not supposed to use a front-end framework, I kind of like forced myself and like for other people to learn it over a weekend so we could make a little cheesy app called Woofer, which was basically like an Uber for dogs, right? It was like a dog sharing service or some cheesy thing like that. I'm actually pretty bummed out I'm not out there with you guys today. Hopefully I get to be there next month and we get to kind of like meet each other and things and talk about Vue things. Anyways, let's actually go ahead and get to the talk. Oh, really quick side note. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this in kind of like a normal meetup fashion, where I'm just gonna do one long recording, just one take. That way you guys get all the cringeworthiness that comes associated with doing some live coding. Sometimes where things don't always work. And this is actually my second take since my first recording. I actually did not record the audio, so that was 40 minutes of me talking, and the audio didn't record. So it's hopefully this is as good as the first try. Anyways, so what are the sign patterns? So in a nutshell, the sign pattern is going to be a template, solution template that you can use for different. You can use to solve different things, right? Sorry, not solve different things, solve a specific thing. So I guess a form more definition is going to be a design pattern is a general repeatable solution to a commonly occurring problem in software design. A design pattern isn't a finished design that can be transformed directly into code. It's a description or a template for how to solve a problem that can be used in many different situations. So yeah, it's kind of like if you think about like maybe like years ago to your math classes when you learn like the FOIL method. It's kind of the same thing. It's a pattern that it's gonna help you solve a specific it's gonna help you solve a problem that you might encounter when building your app. And normally when we talk about design patterns, you'll see something like the diagram below associated with it, which is just an UML representation of like the pattern. In this case, the one that we have down here is basically what's called the strategy pattern. So basically, it's just a way to like kind of like interchange algorithms at runtime. So basically, maybe you need process A when something happens, or you need process B depending on that. They kind of have like the same interface, but they're gonna go ahead and carry out different things differently. So that's what, and kind of like what the strategy pattern is. It's visualized down here, but that one's really not that important right now. It's just to get you guys used to seeing that. So why do they exist? Because main reason why design patterns are a thing is because when we're writing software, we tend to run across the same problems over and over, right? Hence why Vue exists, right? Or hence why most of the libraries you kind of use will kind of exist, right? You import a pre-built solution rather than kind of like making your own making your own all over again. So, and most of the time, those libraries and those things have like a common language that you can use, right? Like for example, like in front-end frameworks, you have like the idea of components and things like that. And another thing that we can kind of dive into that's more like a little more directly to this related to the sign patterns is most front-end frameworks need some sort of state management. And you kind of have like what they call like the flux pattern or something like that, which is really kind of just like, I want to say like a modified version of the observable pattern or the publisher subscriber pattern. And that would be something like what Vuex uses or Redux uses, which is actually the diagram that we have down here. So we can see usually have a subject that's being so a subject that's pushing actions into an observer that's kind of like updating the components below it. So this you can kind of think of like this is your state store. This will be like your state store here, and then you'll have like your components being updated by it. So that kind of just gives a common language, because rather than relearning each specific library, so rather than specifically learning Redux or rather than specifically learning Vuex, you can kind of learn the concepts in general of the library, so the pattern it's using to solve. You can kind of like just pick up on that and just kind of like read the documentation to get the implementation details. And they're basically, as I said before, solution templates that you can kind of take from problem to problem rather than having to like reinvent it again. And just to retouch on this, like it's really good at just communicating with other people your ideas. So there's actually different types of design patterns, or kind of like put into different buckets, such as there is creational patterns, structural patterns, behavioral patterns, and architectural patterns. They all kind of deal with different things. So the creational patterns is going to just deal with the instantiation of objects, just like newing, like let's say newing up objects, and the different ways of doing that, right? Because sometimes you don't want like the actual, like let's say in this case, the view component, like the component that's going to be using X object to actually know all the details of how to build up that object, and that's kind of what we'll get into like in just a second. But then we have also structural patterns, which kind of deal with the relationships between objects. We also have behavioral patterns, which is how objects communicate, and then we have your architectural patterns, which is things like MVC, MVVM, and those little different things. Just as a side note, what Vue is kind of like an MVVM pattern. It doesn't really matter right now though. Oh, and there's one more that I did not include here, which I'm not really gonna mention just because it kind of deals with like multi-threading and stuff like that, which is something that JavaScript doesn't have since we're single-threaded over here. Okay, so when to use the design patterns? This is gonna sound really weird, but you should almost never use them. So when you're trying to like pick out what pattern you want to use, you have to kind of know your problem relatively well, or the thing you're trying to solve, like relatively well, and kind of how it's going to change in the future, right? Because some patterns will have some pitfalls depending on how your application changes and things like that. So you're going to have to be able to kind of foresee how things are going to work, or what requirements you're going to have a little bit into the future, right? And sometimes they can be like basically like using a sledgehammer to drive in a small nail. So you kind of only want to use them when your app or your code base is sufficiently large. So let's say like if you want to think about it in terms of like view, right? You want to go ahead and think about like if you have maybe like 4 views and like 12 components, maybe it's not really worth implementing any patterns. The same way you probably wouldn't bring in VueJS for an app that small. Obviously, depending on how your state management is for that app, it could actually be complex, or it could not. So really, I'm going to argue that you almost really never use them unless you're really, really sure it's the best fit. So you're going to have to do your research, right? And the reason why I'm really trying to drive in this point is because you normally encounter design patterns right after your first year of kind of like being a developer, right after you get like through that whole like rush of maybe like learning every single library you can think of, how like this, like basically like trying to like keep up with all the JavaScript libraries, I guess will be the best way to describe it. You kind of like grow out of that, and you kind of like want to learn more about software in general. And design patterns is something usually you encounter first, and you're like, oh my god, this is really, really cool. I kind of want to use this for every single little thing, and you really shouldn't. They have their time and place. So below it's a good link to a really good I want to say blog post, or like a little 5-minute read, which kind of describes the different growth stages of a programmer. Usually kind of like when you encounter design patterns, you're in the philosophy and abstractor thing that he describes, and that's gonna kind of when you kind of like start using things for the sake of looking smart. But anyways, okay, enough about that. What about Vue? How does this fit into Vue? Well, we're going to kind of look at one thing at a time. We're only going to be covering one pattern today. Obviously, we don't have all day. There's a lot of them. And some of them actually fit into Vue. Some of them might not fit fully into Vue. And quick side note about JavaScript. We're going to completely ignore the existence of TypeScript for the purpose of this talk. Because it kind of like changes things and to actually provides you with interfaces and things like that. But sometimes design patterns are really kind of like brought up because they're used to kind of like cover up the deficiencies that a language might have. Because sometimes some languages are missing certain features, and things like that. So some patterns already kind of sometimes build into the language, even if you don't think about it. And another thing is a lot of the patterns are based on like really like object-oriented programming, and we all know object-oriented programming is a little bit weird in JavaScript since we're kind of using a prototypical model rather than just your inheritance-based model. So sometimes they're not really fully used a lot compared to like let's say like a C# or Java world person will kind of like use them. I think they would probably be a little bit more familiar with the like design patterns in general, which brings me to a really good question that I don't have an answer for, but I want to research more. Is why are like patterns, or like talk about patterns and things like that, it's not so much talked about in the JavaScript world. I think that's like a really good topic to research, but that's for another time. So tonight's pattern, the builder pattern. So what is the builder pattern? we're gonna go ahead and give you the actual like raw definition of it, and then we'll kind of like dive in and actually like break it down, right? So in this case, it's a pattern or a template to separate the construction of a complex object from its representation so that the same construction process can create different representations. Blah. That's like a mouthful. It really kind of doesn't mean anything unless you actually kind of like have a diagram next to it, which we do. So the best way to think about like the builder pattern in this case is kind of think about it like a factory. Pretty sure you guys have heard that before, such as like a factory function or factory pattern or whatever. Yeah, the factory patterns, I think, and actually the builder pattern is like an offshoot of that. And we'll cover that in just a second as well. But anyways, think about it when you go to a restaurant, right? You as the client, you really don't go into the kitchen and start telling people what you need and how you want your meal prepared. You will normally interact with maybe a waiter or a cashier, which will kind of direct the kitchen or the builder in this case on how to make your order, right? So if we kind of follow this diagram that we have right here, when you walk in, let's say you want to order a kids meal, right? You will tell the cashier that, and then the cashier will obviously put it in the register, which kind of directs the kitchen to kind of build out your order, right? So the builder will kind of take care of the builder or builders will take care of making your burger, making your drinks, making your dessert, and making sure the little like toy gets in the bag, and then you get back the meal. At no point did you have to care how that meal was made. You just care that you received it and you're getting it back. So maybe I want to think of an example of this before diving into like the Vue implementation of it. Is maybe when you're using like an SDK for something, right? A lot of times you kind of use like an SDK to like consume an API rather than just bringing in Axios and just consuming the endpoints directly, right? And a lot of times when you kind of use those SDKs, you kind of pass in your like keys that you're going to be using and things like that. And all you know at the end of the day is you kind of receive back an object you can kind of like you can use to make requests, right? And they'll kind of like handle authentication for you and other things for you automatically. So basically, that's kind of like the same pattern, right? You're not really caring that the SDK is instantiating maybe fetch or access behind the scenes. You really just care at the end of the day. You told your SDK, you gave it your keys, and you're getting back an object which we can make requests with. That will be kind of an example of it. So if you want to see like the diagram representation of it, here it is. For intents and purposes, since we're using JavaScript, the builder and concrete builder are the same thing, right? Because we don't have interfaces in JavaScript. So basically, it can be made up of the director, the builder, the concrete builder, and the product. So the builder is the interface for creating parts of the product. The concrete builder implements the builder interface and does the work. And then the director coordinates the building of the product via the concrete builder. So the director kind of like calls the concrete builder and tells it to build the product, which is the thing that's being built. In this case, the director will kind of call or concrete builder directly. I know a lot of times you might hear like code to an interface, not to a concretion. That's the reason for the builder being an interface. But in our case, yeah, we don't have interfaces, so it doesn't matter. So ideas for using this with Vue. So think about maybe like layouts. Different user types can have different access to like different data. So like if you think about it in terms of a dashboard layout, maybe user A has a completely different access to data and like it gets a different layout than user V. That could be probably a use for it. But the main use I want to cover and the main use that interests me in this case is forms. Because forms are one of those things that can seem simple and like in a sense, right? Because you think, oh, it's just an input, you're just gonna add an input, we're just capturing some data. But they can actually be one of the most, they're gonna be the most complex things in most front-end apps. Granted, there might be some apps that use maybe something else that might be more complex, but for the most part, forms are the most complex things, and there's tons of them, especially like in an enterprise app when it's really just form central, I would say. And I personally don't like writing forms directly, so I would look for insane ways to actually avoid writing forms. Which is actually how I ended up kind of like writing this talk. I didn't exactly type in how not to write, like how to avoid writing forms in Vue, but I personally was looking for a better way to use a form library rather than just kind of having to like create specific components such as a user form component, which you will see in just a second what I mean. So let's actually go ahead and implement this together, and we'll do some live code, and hopefully, since this is technically a live talk, hopefully the live coding goes well. Not 100% sure that might work. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, we just exit here. Okay, cool. And VS Code is over here. Awesome. It actually worked. So let me go ahead and make my text a little bit bigger. That way we can actually all see. I'm not sure if that actually matters that much. So let's go ahead and build our app. Hopefully everything goes fine. And no dependency is missing. Awesome, it worked. Let's go into it. So basically, this is our app for this example. It's just two little forms, right? It's just like user create form, user edit form. They can be submitted. They have validation. Yeah. So there's that. Cool. So let's kind of dive into the stuff. A lot of this stuff is already kind of pre-built for us. Actually, almost all of it is going to be pre-built. It will take forever to kind of like just type it out, and we don't want to be here all night. So basically, we have a couple of different things in our app. Obviously, we have our main component, which is just kind of calling the forms. You can see kind of here, there's kind of two ways we're going to be instantiating forms, and we'll cover that in a second. And then one thing I want to bring your attention to is this folder here called form bits. So form bits is just really going to be like a bunch of little form bits and pieces. But the main thing to look at here is going to be the form factory. So if we click on the form factory, you kind of see like it's kind of like the messiest component we actually will have for the most part, since forms are messy. That's their nature, in my opinion. So basically what this form factory here is doing is kind of like taking in a bunch of different data and kind of composing the form for us, right? One thing I want to note is this component thing right here. This is actually how you do dynamic components, or like change components dynamically in Vue with the component is thing. A lot of people forget that, and I always forget that, and I feel like I always end up rediscovering it like a few months down the road whenever I actually need it. It's happened to me multiple times where I ask the same question. It's like, how do you do this? And then I remember that's a thing. But anyways, this component is just taking care of like handling a bunch of different options for us. We're not really going to dive into its implementation. It's just a form factory. And then the rest are actually pretty simple, right? They're just really, really plain old components. There's an input component, there's a label component, and you'll see why we kind of break them down like the way we did in just a second. And then the next thing to look at here is going to be actually going to be the user form. So the user form is like the normal way you would always use your forms, right? You kind of like will go ahead and make a user form, registration form. If you have a settings form, you kind of like end up with a couple different components with that naming scheme a lot of times, right? So in this case, we're just kind of using a form factory. So think about this like when you import like a form library that you have a form like the form component, and you're passing in like the configuration object, which is just normal plain old JavaScript objects. This is kind of the same thing right here, right? This is the normal thing we would do. We kind of like we have some components in this case because we're using component is. We kind of like we're kind of doing the same thing you've kind of seen already in multiple other form libraries, right? We kind of like, hey, use this component, give it this label, give it this name, give it this option, this is the validations, blah. We kind of like, this is a plain old way of doing it. And the thing about it is that it works. So if you have a couple forms, this is not a bad way to go. So this is what we're currently using to instantiate our app. But now, what else can we do to kind of like move our forms around? Well, we kind of use the builder pattern. So we're kind of like just instantiate this, look at it real quick, and then we'll kind of break down into how it's built. I think that's the best way to go with this. So basically we have a form director, a form builder, and we're telling it to make us a user form. So that's all we have to do. And if we go here, oh my god, it didn't change. It's still the same thing. We're still making a user form. So what's the difference between this and this? Well, it's the implementation, right? So this implementation is actually going to add more complexity to our app, but it's also going to give us more flexibility. So I personally wouldn't use this unless I'm making an app I know it's going to be huge and it's going to have a lot of forms that are going to kind of repeat themselves with maybe slight variations. If this was just on like a normal app with maybe like 5 forms or things like that, I probably wouldn't use this. It's kind of like really heavyweight in my opinion. But anyways, that's the builder pattern. That's what we're talking about today. So it's what we'll cover. So anyways, let's actually go ahead and focus in on the builder and the director. So as we know, the director is the thing that's kind of like directing how the object is being created. In this case, how the form is being created, and the form builder is the thing actually doing the work. So let's actually take a quick look at the form builder first, and then we'll take a look at the form director. So at first glance, this seems like a normal JavaScript object, which it is. It's a class. But the only thing that's going to be weird about this, and I want to touch on first, it's going to be it uses a render function. So this is a quick note. Whenever all your templates, all the stuff, all the templates in Vue eventually get rendered, compiled down to render functions, which is basically kind of like how the virtual DOM does its thing. So it's the same thing in like in all front end frameworks, right? It's the same thing in React. Your JSX, which you can actually use in Vue as well, gets compiled down to render functions. So this is kind of what it's doing. I'm not gonna dive into the implementations of it for just really. We're just gonna really we'll kind of like touch on it in just a second what it's doing, but we won't go too deep into it. But anyways, this form builder, which is the actual builder, is taking in fields as props. We have a provider, which in this case, a provider is really just providing like a state to the form. So this can be replaced with VueJS or something like that. Right now, we're using something a little bit weird, which is kind of like using a provider from Vue, which has like inject dependencies, provide dependencies. Not the best thing to use, but it works for simple purposes. And you have an add field method, which is really just adding the field to the props. And then we have the build. So the build is actually the thing that's actually doing the form generation. So it's the thing that's actually gonna render the form to your screen. So basically, it's just kind of grabbing the provider and the props, and it's gonna go ahead and kind of build it all up. It's gonna build the props object right here, and then pass it into the form factory. So as we see, the form factory takes props, right? It's gonna take that configuration object, which is gonna lead to it instantiating the form. So that's basically what we're doing here. We're rendering a form factory with those props, and the provider is just kind of like a wrapper component for now, which is providing the state to the form. But yeah, so that's kind of like the details for the form builder. So not really that complex per se. And then if we look at the form director, first thing we'll notice is we're kind of importing again. We're importing the form bits here, as we did in our normal user form object to instantiate our form. And then we have a normal plain old JavaScript object, which we have a normal constructor, and we have a make user form method in it. And yes, this can technically be a plain old JavaScript object. It can also be a function as well that returns a method. But in this case, let's go ahead and dive into this. So make form is really just going ahead and using the builder, passing in the provider, and then adding fields, right? The same way we did in our user form component. So how is this different? How is this better? So I'm gonna argue that this is better because now we can actually switch the way our forms work without having to go back to our previous component that we don't have to like change our components directly. We can kind of change our forms here. Maybe we can kind of like pull in the form schema from somewhere else, and then build it up here. So one thing I used to do a lot, and this is from because I use Laravel a lot. I use the validators, and one thing I ended up doing once was grabbing the validators, reflecting them to make like the schema for forms, and then I would just import them and automatically build the form from that schema using something like this. That way I wouldn't have to write the form. I would just have to write my validators in my backend, and it would work. It's kind of weird. Not the most efficient thing, right? But so you can see how this can kind of be used for something like that. Well, the cool thing about this is you can kind of keep your forms in one place, your form directory in one place. So how would we your form directory in one place? So how would we make use of this, right? So if we go back to the components, remember at the end of the day, this is returning a component, which is going to be a render function. Your components are really just render functions at the end of the day. So let's say I wanted to make a different component here. Let's say I wanted to add a different form, and let's actually really keep it cheesy, and let's just call this is view cool form. So let's call that, and let's call the form director, and pass in our new form builder, and we're going to tell it to make is view cool form. Obviously right now it's going to blow up because it's not a thing. Let's change it so it should render down here. So it blows up, right? So let's go back into our form director and actually make it. So what do we call the method? I completely forgot. So we call it make is view cool form. So we'll kind of go ahead and start building the method right here. So boom boom. So we need to return the render function at the end of the day. So we're going to do this, return this dot builder, and we don't need a provider with this because we don't want to pass any state to it. We're going to go ahead and add a field, right? And what is this field going to be? Um, so this field is going to be a component, which is going to be a checkbox, right? And then it's going to have a label of is view cool. Name, which is the name of the data in there. So let's call it I don't know, probably a horrible naming scheme right here. So we need, yeah, and then we tell it the form to build. And oh no, it's still broken. Why is it still broken? You say you have no errors, but you're lying to me. Oh, there's a builder, is not a function. It's a method. Wow, I feel dumb. Anyways, so boom, there's our form. It was that quick to generate, right? And we can kind of click it, submit it. In this case, we didn't pass any context to handle the thing. So in this case, previously for the user form, the user provider was providing how it was going to get handled. In this case, we don't have that. Again, that could be replaced with something like VueJS, and that would be the thing that makes everything work. But yeah, so basically going back, sorry, kind of got sidetracked, but going back to implementing this with Vue, you can use it to make your forms. I like it. I like to use it to keep my forms in one centralized space. So we'll have like maybe like in some apps we'll have I'm trying to think of a good example here. We'll have like a settings form director, and then you'll have all your forms for your different settings. And also one thing to note is that you can actually still take params here, so you can kind of like make it. You can actually like feed them different parameters in here that will go into your method, to your into the form builder, and change different like options here and there. So that can make it really flexible in my opinion. And it also does a good job at keeping your templates clean. Again, I really wouldn't use this for like just a couple forms. It's more for apps that have a lot of forms, and where you maybe build the forms dynamically by like maybe like having by like maybe like reflecting or introspecting the schema from the database or from like validators, like what I did in Laravel. So yeah, so just to recap, the builder pattern is just a way to like instantiate an object, such as we did here. So we instantiated a component object, because a component is just an object, without our client kind of being tied to it. In this case, the app components not really tied to what the user form is, as it normally would if you just imported it from the top. So yeah, that's the builder pattern, and this was all one take. Hopefully you guys like it. If you guys have any comments or questions, you guys can just email me. I'm actually always on the ODev Slack, so if you guys want to Slack me, that's also fine. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there with you guys. I wish you guys could see like me kind of like making weird hand motions to the computer, because sometimes it's kind of hard to explain some things with just words and text. Words and text are the same thing. Sorry. It's just kind of hard to explain things and not be there in person. So hopefully you guys like it, and that's it. Bye, guys.